Okay, so I have some interesting family history that I've talked about a few times on other people's chats or whatever, but I wanted to make a video on it here. Again, more or less for my nephew for the future. Um, so, first off, because of some family genealogy and stuff that my grandpa and mom did, I know that the first person to come to this country that I'm related to came here in 1620 and was an indentured servant in Jamestown Colony, and then went on to be some sort of frontiersman. I think that's pretty fucking cool. Not particularly famous, but the next two kind of are. And that's Robert E. Lee is basically like a great uncle kind of thing. And so much so that, like, when we went to Washington, D.C., when I was a kid, my grandfather mentioned that, you know, he thinks that he should own, uh, what is that property? Arlington National Cemetery. I was like, okay, Grandpa. And his logic was that, like, if we're related to Robert E. Lee and that was his property that they took away after the Civil War, then, the government had no right to do that, and that should still be in our family. Like, okay, try writing them about that. Uh, the other famous person in history that I'm related to a lot more closely is Ernest Childers. You can look him up. He won the Congressional Medal of Honor in Italy in World War II. He was like 43 or 44. He was a second lieutenant leading a platoon and took out a series of machine gun nests single handedly. He was my grandfather's father's great grandfather or something like that. Or it's like a whole bunch of fucking removes over. But basically, he's related to my grandfather somehow. And I think that's pretty cool. Uh, we have Native American ancestry through that for sure, and a couple other things. My other side of my family is supposed to have Native American ancestry, but they lost all of our records in a courthouse fire somewhere in like the you know 1890s to 1930s or something like that, and like there's just no getting it back. That kind of sucks. We did DNA testing, and I think it was my grandma. It was my grandma or my mom came back as 4% sub-Saharan African, and we're like the whitest folks you've ever seen. So I thought that was pretty funny. Uh, I wouldn't consider my grandfather to be famous to anyone, but he did some stuff that's cool. He was in the Marine Corps infantry, became a pilot, became a Mustang officer, went to OCS and all that shit. Flew F4 Phantoms, did multiple tours in Vietnam and overseas out of Japan, even flying in to run missions in Vietnam in the later war. Um, he was shot down, I think at least once. I know maybe it was twice, but the one time that I know of for sure that he was shot down, they were on some sort of close air support mission and they got strafed by a 50 caliber machine gun and took out their hydraulics. So they tried to land with no gear on the runway in Da Nang, and they were in a older model of F4 Phantom. I don't remember exactly which one, but it had the old ejection seats in it that if you're not at least a few hundred feet off the ground and going X speed, you're dead. You don't even make it out of the plane, really. So as they're like careening down the runway, there's foam on this runway that is to prevent fires, basically. And they spray it all over the runway when they do a belly landing. Well, they're on this foam and on this foam and cruising along, not slowing down at all. They burst through the arresting cable, they burst through the net, still going. And they run out of foam. Now they're just on tarmac and they're starting to spark and they're catching fire. And the tower is saying, eject, 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 eject. And they, my grandfather and his fellow pilot in the plane were both like, yeah, we're dead if we do that. So they hit full afterburner while going down the runway and took off. My grandfather is alive today because, or was alive until he died, uh, because they hit full afterburner while on the runway and took off like a fucking rocket ship. Then they got out over the fucking Gulf somewhere near a carrier and ejected there. And the story's still not over with him. This is how he got his Purple Heart. They're sitting there in the water, and the Navy helicopter comes and picks up the other guy, starts to pick up my grandfather. It loses power, crashes into the water, and breaks his leg. Somehow regains power and manages to take off, but is now half full of water and limping, and it just flies straight back to the carrier. And my grandfather's now sitting out there in the ocean with a broken leg, and an Army Huey is watching all of this happen somewhere offshore, saw the helicopter crash, saw that they left someone in the water, and went to go help. And they got down low enough that my grandfather could grab the skid of the helicopter. He grabbed on, and then they flew low and slow to shore. And he knew he had the broken leg, so he let go in about 3 feet of water. And apparently, they were somewhere near an ambulance station or something like that, or someone sent them out there. I don't know exactly how the ambulance ended up there, but there was already an ambulance there on the beach waiting for him. And as he's trying to get out of the water on one leg, he's at about 3 or 4 feet of water trying to stand up. And the ambulance driver comes to help him and steps on his broken leg. And my grandfather punches him in the face and knocks him unconscious, and then has to carry him back to the ambulance. Eventually, he is woken up by the other guy in the ambulance or some shit, and they put my grandfather in the back, and they drive him back to the base supposedly. Well, they get in an accident, and he almost dies in the fucking ambulance about a quarter mile from the base or some shit like that. And from there, he elects to walk back because it was safer. And my grandfather's call sign was Hateful because apparently he sounded hateful on the radio. And I think I have a little bit of that voice, a little bit, maybe. His other call sign was Brownie. And that's what people pretty much called him my whole life. After Vietnam, he owned a resort on a lake. And it was Brownie's Resort, a bunch of cabins, his house and a shop, and he'd rent out the cabins for the summer to people, and take care of the property and whatever. And it was a good way to make money. They did that all through the 70s and 80s. And after that, they sold that resort because times were tough, I guess, and one thing led to another, and they had to sell it. And they had an opportunity to sell it for over $1 million at one point, and elected not to do that because they liked running it, and then later had to sell it for basically nothing. And then after that, my grandfather floated around a bit looking for something to do, went back to school at Spartan School of Aeronautics with his Marine Corps shit. He used to run the fucking maintenance pool in his squadron. He was a pretty good aircraft mechanic between that and his mechanical aptitude. and he ended up teaching at Spartan, if I remember right. And he ended up working at American Airlines after that. And he worked there for a long time until he broke his hip. He fell off of some sort of loading bay or something like that and broke his hip. And it was kind of a downward spiral after that, to be honest. But the entire time I knew him, he would do stuff to prepare for the apocalypse and would do gun shows. And those two things were usually interrelated. And I was usually getting drug along to help with both of those things. So, like, some of my interests are because of him. And some of it is I was there alongside him. And the things that I found interesting at the gun show were wilderness survival and knives because I thought that shit was just cool. And it lights my heart to see my nephew Jackson interested in that shit and asking about survival kits and stuff. And I hope he's gonna stay interested in that. Like, he's, living not a good situation in my mind. And his mother's kind of a cunt. And I think his grandfather would love him, basically. He would adore him. He's everything my grandfather ever loved. And it breaks my heart to see it probably getting ruined by some bitch. Well, this wasn't really where this video was supposed to head, but I'm going to leave it anyway. Know your family history. It's important. Go learn it. Go look it up. There's enough shit on the internet now where you can do DNA testing and ancestry and whatever. And if you just know your parents and maybe their parents, that's a lot to start with. That'll start getting you back a ways anyway. So, you know, all this shit's important. Family is important. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and look for my Patreon.